All right, good evening and welcome everyone to Mount Washington Observatory's Science in the Mountains lecture series. My name is Brian Fitzgerald and I'm the Director of Education here at Mount Washington Observatory. And joining us this evening from New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action are Gerson and Bob Dewey, who will be helping us connect the dots between climate change and human health impacts in our region. So thanks again for joining for tonight's program. If you're not already familiar with Mount Washington Observatory, we are a nonprofit, member-supported organization with a mission to advance the understanding of the forces that create Earth's weather and climate. And we do that by conducting around-the-clock weather observation and forecasting, by conducting research and product testing services, and by developing and offering innovative educational programs. If you have questions for tonight's speakers, and if you're joining us through Zoom, make sure you use the Q&A button. You can find it right down at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar there, the Q&A button. We'll make sure to leave some time at the end of the program here, so make sure you get your questions in whenever they bubble up. If you're joining us on the live stream on Facebook, thanks so much for joining us that way. We won't be able to respond to your questions in real time, but we'll make sure to follow up after the program here. If you'd like to connect with us through Zoom for the next program, make sure you go and register for the program over at mountwashington.org. All right, well, thanks once again, everyone, for joining tonight. Before we introduce tonight's speakers, we have a poll for all of you joining us through Zoom, so I'll go ahead and launch that in just 1 second here. If you're joining on Zoom, you should be seeing some poll questions now in front of you in your screen, 4 of them for tonight's program. The first one here, curious where you're joining from. Like always, curious where our audience is joining from across the region. Perhaps it's a state within New England. Perhaps it's outside of New England. Perhaps it's outside the country. Love to know where you're joining from tonight. And then we have a few trivia questions beyond that from our speakers this evening. The first one being, according to the American Lung Association, what percentage of Americans live in areas of unhealthy air? 10, 20, 40, or 60% are your choices there. Next question, which of the following tick-borne diseases is not seen in New Hampshire? So which one is not seen in New Hampshire? Is it Lyme disease? Is it babesiosis? Powassan viral infection? Anaplasmosis? Or do you think all are present in New Hampshire? And then lastly, which disease currently causes, or which disease causes, typo on my end of things here, which causes the most morbidity and mortality worldwide? Is it infectious diseases? Again, my mistake there. Heart disease? Is it health impacts of climate change? Or is it cancer? All right, we'll go ahead and give everyone just 30 more seconds here to get in a response, and we'll share everyone's results. And we'll introduce our speakers right thereafter. So, all right, we'll go ahead and count down 3, 2, 1. All right, we will share some results there. It looks like the majority, just barely joining from New Hampshire this evening. Second place there, folks joining from outside of New England. Welcome to all of you. Great representation across the region here. And in fact, we have at least one person from joining outside the US of A. So welcome to everybody who's joining tonight. All right, so what percentage of Americans live in areas of unhealthy air? A dead split between 40 and 60%. Well, we'll see about that. Which of the following tick-borne diseases is not seen in New Hampshire? Well, the overwhelming majority of you thought that all 4 of those were present in New Hampshire. And then last but not least, almost half of you thought that health impacts of climate change cause the most morbidity and mortality worldwide. So, you know what? We'll see. I do not know the answers to these questions. Perhaps you can tell in how I just described some of these diseases. Well, let's bring in the experts here. At this time, I'd love to welcome both Deb and Bob, representing the Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. Deb, Bob, hey, there you are. I see you both. And I can hear Bob, and I think I can hear Deb too.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining. By all means, take it away.
Okay, well, great.
Deb, can you give us our slides? We have a little slideshow here.
Share my screen.
And first of all, I know Deb joins me in thanking you, Brian, for inviting us to speak today. Our group speaks at a lot of Rotary clubs and library groups. We've never had such a large and international audience before, so this is quite a heady experience. But I am a retired cardiologist from Manchester, New Hampshire. And before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about our group. Go back one, Deb. New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. We are a group that came together in 2021, primarily because we were just very concerned about the direction that the climate crisis was heading, and kind of a lack of an apparent concern about this, especially in New Hampshire. And so we came together. We are all types of healthcare workers, from physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, physical therapists, hospital administrators, mental health workers, school guidance counselors. And our ages range from nursing and medical students all the way up to older retired people. We are completely volunteer, nonpartisan, and our mission is really an educational one. We're trying to teach other healthcare workers and the public about these very serious health impacts of climate change, in a sense, trying to make the climate crisis a little more personal. We hear a lot about the melting ice caps and loss of polar bear habitat, but that seems kind of remote. And we think that when we're talking about our own health, our children's health, and our community's health, that this will hopefully bring the climate crisis, home and make it a little more personal. So that would, in our hope, make people more aggressive in terms of demanding climate solutions from our political and business leaders. And part of the way we try to do this is by having this speakers bureau where we go around the state of New Hampshire giving talks about this. We also do a lot of other things, but that's not part of tonight's talk. So why don't we go ahead? And they always say that you should say why you're here. Why is a guy just enjoying retirement decide to spend so much time on this? And it's because of these little buggers. I have 4 grandchildren, and just trying to do what I can to lead them a better world. And it's getting to the point of if we don't speed things up, they're going to be in a little bit of a pickle. So next slide, please.
Sorry about that, Bob. Okay. I forgot to take that one out.
So we're going to start with the science of climate change, just a little primer. I'm sure most people here are aware of these things, but just so we're all on the same page. And we all know that it's between climate change and weather, and climate change is just the average of conditions over time, such as temperature and rainfall. Next. And that data does show that it's definitely been going up since the post-industrial era. And this is due to the greenhouse effect. The sun obviously heats the earth radiantly, and traditionally about 30 to 35% of that radiant energy gets reflected back into space, and the atmosphere keeps us in this nice little sweet spot for life. But as we've been collecting these greenhouse gases, primarily CO2 and methane, the molecular structure of these is such that they will absorb heat. And so the heat that normally previously was reflected back into space is staying in the atmosphere. Next. And we said that's primarily because of CO2. And this is the Keeling curve, which you all had a lecture about last year with Professor Keeling's son. That was pretty exciting. But this shows that going back 800,000 years, this level of CO2 in the atmosphere has been pretty steady between about 180 and 280 parts per million. And this data is, of course, taken from CO2 concentrations in ice bubbles at the poles. And then after we started burning fossil fuels, a little before the Civil War, CO2 started going up. We crossed 300 parts per million in 1950 and are now up to about over 420. And unfortunately, it is still going up. Next. And this is something we've known about for a long time. This is an article from Popular Mechanics from 1912, basically saying that the furnaces of America are burning, of the world, are burning 2 trillion tons of coal a year, which releases 7 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And they say this tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. Well, it obviously didn't take a few centuries. Next. So this is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from 2021, this actual data. And this is kind of what got our group fired up, because this was the first time that the IPCC actually said that warming was unequivocally due to human activity. And then at that point, we had gone up 1.1 degrees Celsius since the mid 1800s, and that we will reach 1.5 degrees centigrade within 2 decades. And I think from what we've been seeing, most people would agree it's probably not going to take that long, sadly. But the reason we focus on 1.5 degrees is that was the temperature that the Paris Climate Accords from 2015 were trying to keep us below. Because once you get up more towards 2 degrees or higher, that's when you get very aggressive melting of the ice caps and very serious sea level rise. Now, sadly, New Hampshire is kind of leading the curve on this, and we are already at 1.5. The Gulf of Maine is actually the 95th percentile for warming bodies of water. So it's right here in New Hampshire and New England. Now, this next slide shows shows emissions over time, and just to kind of show where we are, the lower blue curve is what we ideally need to do to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, or to stay close to it, because we're not going to stay below it. And in order to try to get close to 1.5, we have to quit burning fossil fuels by 2050, and we have to reduce the burning in half by 2035. And if you look up higher, the pledged policies, that kind of yellow line, shows what people promised to do at the Paris Accords. And the red line above that shows actual what's going on. So it looks like we're kind of headed for about 2.5, and hopefully we can try to bring that curve down a little further as time goes by. Next. So with that as an introduction, how does this affect our health? First, I just want to try to put a little bit of the magnitude of the problem to you. This editorial on the left-hand side is from the New England Journal of Medicine, also from 2021, and it's entitled Call for Emergency Action to Limit Global Temperature Increases, Restore Biodiversity, and Protect Health. Now, this editorial was published simultaneously in over 250 medical journals this same month of that year. And that's the first time anything like this has happened in organized medicine. And it is really a call to action to the medical community, basically to say, number one, this is the real deal. And number two, you have got to figure out how you can advise your patients and treat your patients going forward. And lastly, and this is what we're trying to do, is use your voice to try to influence the local debate on this, to kind of hopefully wake people up to this problem. That same year, 2021, WHO said climate change is the greatest health emergency there is, causing more morbidity than all other medical problems combined. Answer to question number one. And that same year, a study came out from the NRDC just looking at the cost in terms of dollars for what the cost of healthcare from climate problems was just in the United States, and it was $800 billion. And when you compare that number to cardiovascular disease, which was always the number one killer, that only came in at $300 billion. So it really does dwarf the other medical problems we're up against. So this little cartoon just shows what's going on. We have increasing CO2 levels, leading to rising temperatures, more extreme weather, and rising sea levels. And then this spins out to cause problems with air pollution, changes in vector ecology, increasing allergens, water and food impacts, environmental degradation, extreme heat, and severe weather. And we're going to touch on a couple of these tonight. So we're going to start with air quality. Next. Basically, when you burn fossil fuels in any type, whether it's solid coal, liquid gasoline or oil or gas, methane or propane, you get these fossil fuel related air pollutants, ground level ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. I want to just focus a little bit on particulate matter tonight. It comes in three different sizes. PM10 is less than 10 microns, and that comes from road dust and wildfires. PM 2.5, which is the one you see reported a lot, is less than 2.5 microns in diameter, and it comes from burning fossil fuels and wildfires. And ultrafine PM, which is a tenth of a micron, comes from tailpipe exhaust. And keep in mind that a red blood cell is 8 microns, so these are tiny compared to that. So what does this do to us? Well, particulate matter is known to worsen COPD in adults, and it actually is a cause for asthma in kids. Studies do show that children who live in areas of high PM 2.5 actually have a higher incidence of asthma. It is a known carcinogen, and it can cause vascular events such as stroke and heart attack. Well, how does it do that? Well, if you think about it, when you inhale particulate matter, the PM10 is big enough that it can be filtered out by our air passages. But PM 2.5 and ultrafine PM are so small that they can get inhaled deeply into the alveolar sacs where air exchange takes place. And they're small enough that they can cross the capillary membranes and actually get into the blood supply, the vascular supply, and then just circulate around the body. And so this, whenever you get a little foreign body in a vessel like that, it will cause inflammation and be a nidus for a stroke or heart attack. It's also been shown in people that live in areas of high PM 2.5 that autopsy studies show that these folks actually have particulate matter in their brain. So it's not surprising that people who live in areas of high PM2 have higher levels of dementia. It can cause pregnancy complications, low birth weight, premature delivery, and then cognitive problems in children. Next. And here's just some data from New Hampshire. You know, in New Hampshire, we only have a couple of big cities, and they're not even that big, but we think our air is pretty good. But look at this. This is from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and this is the annual rate of premature death due to PM 2.5 from the years 2013 to 2015. Lost work days, 67,000, 500,000 acute respiratory problems. And what's striking is the cost of this is $3.7 billion per year in little old New Hampshire, where we actually think we have pretty good air. So it's really everywhere. Next. So there is some good news in all this, and this is that improving the air does result in very quick improvements in health. And this is data to show that from 1996, when the Summer Olympics were in Atlanta, Georgia. And due to that, there was a reduction in morning traffic of only 23%, so a very modest reduction. And this led to a 20% reduction in ozone levels and particulates. And there was a 42% reduction in ER visits with children for asthma. So really a very modest reduction resulted in a pretty good health improvement. And we saw the same thing actually early during the COVID crisis when people weren't driving as much. Next. But the best example of that is the benefits of the Clean Air Act, which was, of course, Richard Nixon's greatest moment when he founded the EPA and passed this Clean Air Act back in 1970. And anybody who remembers way back then, that Clean Air Act was fought tooth and nail by big industry, by the oil companies, automobile companies, saying that there's no way we can afford to do this. The economy is too fragile. The same arguments we hear time and time again. But it got passed, and in a bipartisan way, which is certainly unusual by our standards these days. And these are the health benefits that accrued over the subsequent 50 years And it's really staggering. 230,000 fewer deaths per year over 50 years, 2.4 million fewer asthma attacks per year, and 200,000 fewer heart attacks per year over 50 years. So a tremendous improvement in health. And when you look at the health savings or the money savings just from the improvement in health, the Clean Air Act paid us back 30-fold, which we just see time and time again. Whenever we improve the environment, we get tremendous payback. So despite all of that improvements, we still, this is data from the American Lung Association last year, still 40% of Americans, or 135 of us, still live in areas of unhealthy air. And populations of color are 3 times more likely to live in these areas. And this is just one of the many examples that we'll see tonight of kind of the social injustice of the climate crisis, in that the people, not just in the United States, but worldwide, people that had the least to do with the climate crisis suffered disproportionately. The Lung Association also concludes that there'll be tremendous cost savings when we do, and if we get to, let's go back one slide, Deb. When we do get to, if we go to zero emission energy and transportation, by 2050, we will have saved $1.2 trillion in healthcare. So there still is tremendous savings if we stick with it. And finally, I just want to say something about pollen. As a cardiologist, I saw lots of patients who had COPD, chronic obstructive lung disease, and we would see these patients coming in the spring and summer, as long as 25 years ago, with their COPD compensated. And I would often call their pulmonologist or their allergist and say, yeah, I think this fellow should have some steroids. And the allergist would always say the same thing: oh my God, it's been the worst pollen season we've ever had. And this was 25 years ago, and we really weren't connecting the dots then. And we'd kind of roll our eyes and say, oh, the allergists are blaming it on pollen. But in fact, they were absolutely right. And what's happened is the growing season in New Hampshire has lengthened 34 days in the last 50 years. And so the growing season is longer. So there's there's more time to make pollen. And we already talked about the high CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And as we know, that drives photosynthesis, and that creates higher concentrations of pollen as plants are getting bigger and putting out more pollen. So, and in fact, studies do show that just from 2001 to 2010, pollen levels were up 42%, and they're probably going to do more than double in the next decade. So in fact, we had evidence of climate health problems as long back as 25 years ago, but we just weren't paying attention. So next, I think Deb's going to take over here.
Okay, so hi, I'm Deb Gerson. I'm a pathologist, which is a doctor of laboratory medicine for anyone who doesn't know. And I work at Catholic Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I want to keep the world and New Hampshire a beautiful and healthy environment for my family and my 2 daughters who are here, and one of our dogs, and everyone else's families, to be able to enjoy the beauty and splendor that we've had. And I just absolutely love New Hampshire, and I appreciate being invited to the Mount Washington Observatory talk. I've been up to the Mount Washington Observatory almost every way that you can get there, by the Cog Railway when I was a kid, and I've driven up, and I meant to put a picture in, but I forgot to do it, of my family climbing up there last year. So anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. And the other pictures here you can see, this is my oldest daughter quite a long time ago. And this is when we lived in Miami in 2005, the day before Hurricane Wilma hit. And you can see Rachel's kind of looking out as we're starting to get some wind kicking up. And there was a really big storm. And so here you can see my husband the day after the storm trying to clean up in our backyard. And this was the first time that I really realized that there was a connection between climate change and human health. There were 3 large hurricanes between August and October of 2005 that you will probably have heard of all three of them, maybe not Wilma, which was the one I experienced, but Katrina and Rita were also during that 3-month period. And scientists have figured out that the number of severe hurricanes is increasing due to climate change. And so for me, not only were there some people who were injured directly by the hurricane, by going surfing, for example, during the storm, or being involved in flooding, but also there were a lot of problems just related to the infrastructure in the city. After the hurricane, the town of Miami had 16 functioning traffic lights. Out of the whole Miami-Dade County, only 16 functioning traffic lights. So you can imagine the traffic was a disaster. There were trees down everywhere. If someone had a health event and needed to get to the hospital, it was really difficult. No one had air conditioning because their electricity was out. And so there were a lot of older people that were suffering in the heat. People didn't have refrigeration to keep their food and medicines cold. So there were an enormous number of problems that I had never really considered you could have after an emergency like this. So I'm going to talk about extreme weather events. And in New England, we're not really as worried about hurricanes as I was when I lived in Florida. But in New Hampshire, we're expecting to have increasing heavy rainfall with flooding and storms and storm surge. So you can see from this graphic here that heavy downpours are increasing. And what I mean by that is that each rainfall event contains more water. And you can see even in parts of the country that we think of as having droughts, like the Southwest, they have more numbers of heavy downpours. So even though they're getting less rain, they're getting more of it in heavy rain events. And New England is having a especially high impact from this. The reason for this is that the warmer atmosphere creates more evaporation, and for every 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming, the saturation level increases by about 4%. So with more water up in the atmosphere, there's more rain that comes down. And some of you may have noticed that this was an extremely wet summer that we had this year. It was the wettest summer ever on record. We had greater than 21 inches of rain this summer, and it was more than we've ever had since record keeping started. Additionally, we've always had high tides and some floods in New England, but as we have sea level rise happening, coastal floods are increasing as the sea level is higher, and the usual types of high tides and astronomical tides are causing increased flooding. And there's a significant increase in flooding that has happened over the last 50 years. And along the East Coast, the predicted sea level rise is for the next 30 years is 10 to 14 inches, which is pretty significant. And there are a lot of properties that are already at risk. And I have a picture here from Hampton, New Hampshire, from a flood in the last couple of years where there was a lot of property damage. And these tides and storm surge heights are expected to increase and reach further inland. And we're expected to have more damaging coastal flooding every year. So how does this impact health? It's sort of obvious that you could have accidents or traumatic injury due to flooding, but there are other things that can happen as well. So you can imagine with all of this water that you see around these homes here in various floods in New Hampshire, their water can seep into septic systems, and it can seep into various types of infrastructure and get contaminated, and that can spread into our soils and waterways, leading to viral and bacterial contamination or contamination with other types of contaminants. And since, as we know, a lot of the historical development in New Hampshire has been along rivers and canals and coasts, these sites often have a higher density of contaminated materials, and so they're extra vulnerable to flooding as well. So sort of a double whammy. Additionally, increased mental health problems have found to be a significant problem that occurs after extreme weather events. And you can imagine that if you lived in one of these homes, you would have a lot to deal with, and it might increase your anxiety or depression. So there's been a huge increase in very expensive billion-dollar disasters in the U.S. Over the last number of years. And there's several reasons that these are increasing. One of the reasons is that climate change is supercharging the storms and increasing the frequency and intensity of certain types of extreme weather. But additionally, there's an increase in population and material wealth, and people are building along coasts and at the interface between wildlands and cities, and in river floodplains. So they're not thinking about these problems when they're building. So we're having an increase in very expensive disasters. And I'm going to turn it back over to Bob to talk about extreme temperatures.
Okay, well, after the hottest summer on record worldwide, we all know about extreme heat, and this is just some data from Climate Central showing that in New Hampshire, extreme heat days have increased seven more days. But if we continue as we are, this number will probably double or quadruple in the next decade. Next. And even though heat in the summer is what gets all the headlines, it's actually warming relatively more in the fall and winter. Here, this graph shows that New England is warming about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. And that's where we're really seeing a lot of the warming. Next. And heat deaths are increasing. On average, there's about 700 heat deaths in the United States per year. And this graph just shows how if you compare yearly average of the previous decade, 2021 beat it by far, and death and heat causes more deaths than any of the other climate emergencies: flood, cold temperatures, wind, etc. Next. And who gets in trouble? Who has more of the deaths? Well, you can see here in a per capita, Native Americans and African Americans again suffer disproportionately compared to whites. Again, just speaking to the social injustice of the climate crisis. Next. So what happens when we get hot? There's several levels of heat illness, from just heat exhaustion all the way to heat stroke. And basically, when the body is overheated, of course we perspire, but the body wants to cool itself. So to do that, it wants to get blood near the surface of the skin. So what will happen is the heart rate will go up, and then the arteries in our arms and legs will dilate to try to get blood towards the surface to release heat. And with this vasodilatation, of course, the blood pressure will fall and the heart rate will go up even more. So if you were a patient of mine who's had a heart attack and has had some hypertension and on a diuretic, you can see how these people could really go south in a hurry. And then if it goes on to heat stroke, where temperature is 104, that can cause some major morbidity, if not death, if these people aren't cooled down very quickly. And that's when you have to pop people right into an ice bath to get their temperature down very quickly. And just a word about sweating. Sweating is our number one defense against heat, but in fact, on very humid days, sweating is really not effective, because what happens, we get the sweat on our skin, but it's actually the evaporation of the sweat that causes the cooling. And when the air is already saturated, so it can't take any more water, that becomes ineffective. And that's why they use a combination of temperature and humidity when they tell you the effective heat index. Go ahead. So who's at risk for this? Well, inner city populations, of course, people who live in downtown and where there's a lot of asphalt and not much green space. Some downtowns can be 40 to 50% asphalt, which will absorb heat and can get in trouble in a hurry. We see more deaths in high school and college athletes every August. The numbers go up every year with deaths and very serious heat illnesses in this group. And then, of course, people who work outside and lastly, the children and elderly.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about vector-borne diseases. So what is a vector-borne disease? These are infections that are transmitted by arthropods like mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas, and you've probably heard of a number of examples of these. And what we see here is my dog, Lucky, one of my dogs, and we took him for a hike in one of our nice trails here in New Hampshire about 3 weeks ago, and when we came back, there were 10 ticks on him. And this is a rather poor picture in the middle there at the bottom, but it shows that this was a deer tick. And several of the ticks that we found on Lucky were deer ticks. And I'll talk about why that's significant in a second. So one of my jobs as a pathologist is to review peripheral blood smears. And this is where they take a patient's blood and put it on a slide. And what you can see here is that we have some nice red blood cells, which are these red donut looking things. And these ones look nice. And then here's a platelet, which is what we all know seals up holes in our blood vessels when we get an injury. But then we see in some of the red blood cells, there are these purple ring-shaped structures. And these shouldn't be here. And when I used to work in Florida, when we saw something that looked like this, it was almost always malaria. But up here in New Hampshire and New England, when we see ring-shaped structures like this, unless the patient has a history of traveling to somewhere that has malaria, and especially if we see some of the structures lining up to form a cross shape like we do in some of these red blood cells, this is an organism called Babesia microti, and it causes babesiosis. So these tick-borne diseases, like babesiosis, are increasing across the country and in New Hampshire, and they are transmitted by the black-legged tick that you see a much better picture of on this slide. And here we have some preliminary data from the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, just showing that anaplasmosis and babesiosis, two tick-borne diseases, have been increasing significantly. And we also have Lyme disease, as most of you probably know, and I would guess that many of you have known somebody who has Lyme disease or has had Lyme disease. And additionally, there is a very scary virus called Powassan virus, which is also transmitted by ticks. And it has also been found in New Hampshire. Luckily, very infrequently. It causes inflammation of the brain. So that's a scary one. But luckily, we've only had a handful of cases in the last 20 years in New Hampshire. So hopefully that one will stay nice and low. And what you can see on this chart is that the Lyme disease cases have increased dramatically. So each one of the blue dots in this picture here shows one case of Lyme disease. And you can see that compared to 1996, those in 2018 are spreading further west and further north. And there's just a whole lot more dots. So the incidence of Lyme disease has increased quite a bit and has nearly doubled during this period of time. And in case you're wondering why Massachusetts looks white here in 2018, they had a change in reporting standards in that particular year, not an absence of Lyme disease. And so why does climate change increase these vector-borne diseases? Well, the main reason is just that it's warmer. So we're having shorter winters, and this is the same graph that Bob showed you earlier, and you can see we've got on average 34 more days that are frost-free. So this is great for my tomato plants, but not great for ticks because they're out and looking to bite us and drink our blood and transmit their diseases to us for 34 extra days in the summer. And then even in the winter sometimes, if the temperature can just get above 45 degrees, ticks can come out and bite us. And then one last very quick topic, although you could have a whole talk on this, is mental health and well-being. There's quite a few different ways that climate change can impact mental health. One of them is extreme weather events, as I alluded to earlier, and these have been shown to increase significantly mental health problems following the event, including stress and PTSD. Suicide rates have increased significantly following extreme weather events, and this was studied a lot after Katrina and Rita. Also, extreme heat has been associated with increasing violence and aggression. And individuals with mental illness are especially vulnerable. So what I mean by that is twofold. First of all, those with mental illness originally are more likely to suffer from worse mental health after an extreme weather event, and more likely to have increasing violence and aggression or risk-taking behaviors after an extreme heat event. But also, some of the medications that they take make them not well suited to be in a heat wave. And they did a case study of about 1,000 heat-related deaths in heat waves. And they found that if you had pre-existing mental illness, you had triple the risk of death when exposed to a heat wave. And then, of course, there's climate anxiety, which hopefully I haven't increased your climate anxiety too much tonight. And this is just the idea that many of us are worried about climate change and how it's going to impact our lives. And this amount of anxiety seems to increase the younger the patient is. A recent study asked 10,000 people in 10 countries how they felt about climate change, and these were kids ages 16 to 25, and nearly 60% says they were very or extremely worried, and 45% of the participants said their feelings about climate change impacted their daily lives. Okay, so is there hope? Can we fix this? The good news is that I really think we can. I wouldn't be wasting my time going out telling everyone about this if I didn't think that we could do it. But we're going to need to do two things, basically. We need a two-pronged approach. We need to do mitigation, which is where we reduce our emissions and stabilize the greenhouse gases that we have already in the atmosphere. And then we need to do adaptation, where we adapt to the climate changes that are already occurring. So the great news about mitigation is that our scientists and engineers have done an amazing job of coming up with most of the solutions that we're going to need, and they're going to be working overtime to come up with solutions in the future. So we all know that the wind could supply a lot of electricity, and it could supply our worldwide electricity 40 times over globally. And there's been a lot of progress in wind power. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly so we can have some questions. So huge amount of wind power progress, and lots of wind power has been being generated, and more is going to be built. Solar power also, there's so much of it. And there's been a huge increase in solar power generation in the US just here in the last 20 years, you can see on this chart. And in the past, people might have said that we couldn't afford to convert to renewable energy. But if you can see in this graph here, solar and wind power are now some of the cheapest forms of electricity. Bob, I'm going to skip one or two of these slides if that's okay with you. I want to do this one though. This is something that has given me a lot of hope in the last couple of years, the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is a graph that shows what is predicted to happen as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. And my favorite part of this chart actually on this graph is that I didn't realize that our greenhouse gas emissions in the US were already falling prior to this Inflation Reduction Act. So here you see from 2005 to the current time, they were already decreasing. But if you look here, this is a model of the expected impacts of the Senate Inflation Reduction Act, which did pass in 2022. And there's the blue line at the bottom shows what we need to get to the Paris Agreement levels of net zero. And then the lines at the top show what was expected to happen with the current policies prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. And the purple line shows what we're expecting due to the Inflation Reduction Act. So it looks like we've gotten about 65 or 70% of the way to where we need to be. And we just need to keep making additional progress to get to that point. And also we're expecting to have a lot of increased jobs due to the Inflation Reduction Act. And just by decreasing the particulate emissions, we're expecting to have an enormous number of avoided deaths and asthma attacks and lost work days. This is just a 1 year modeled number of avoided deaths from the year 2030. So you can imagine there's all the ones that you would save leading up to that as well. I'm just going to skip right to the end because I know we're almost out of time, and we can talk about other things if you want to later. But as far as what we can, as individuals, do about this, I think that the most important thing is to make sure your elected officials know what you think about this. You can call, write, or email your elected officials and tell them that you care about climate change and that you want them to do something about it. You can call them no matter which political party they're in. This is a nonpartisan issue. It's going to impact all of us. But also you can vote with climate in mind. Join a climate group. Please feel free to join our climate group or come visit our website. We have a lot of free activities and teaching. Bob, do you have anything else you want to suggest from this list?
No, I think the most important thing, honestly, is people are reluctant to talk about climate change. It's been a polarizing issue in the recent past, and even though studies do show that 65% of Americans, 65 to 70% of Americans are quite concerned about the climate crisis, only about 30% actually talk about it to their friends because it's intimidating. You think, oh, I don't really know enough about it. But I think it's important that we all talk about it and just try to raise the level of awareness. One of our things is we're just trying to make the climate crisis higher on people's priority list. And I think talking about it with your friends and family is a great way to do that.
I really like this quote, and this is our last slide. And I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. So please come visit our website, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Deb. Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate you both taking the time to share on this important topic tonight. And as you referenced, now's a great time for questions. I've been watching along, and also we've already gotten some really thoughtful questions from our audience. So thank you to those of you who submitted a question already. Again, as a reminder, if you want to ask a question of Bob or Deb, we'll try and get to as many as possible here in the next 15 minutes or so. And for any that we miss, we'll make sure to find a way to connect you with both of our speakers tonight. I wanted to start off, if you don't mind. This is a great question that kind of came up from the first question that popped up from participant Adam, who was curious. Might paraphrase a little bit, but Adam might have some maybe isn't so sure about some of the information perhaps that you were presenting on climate and all those sorts of things. But he was asking what I thought was a good question to ask, which is, hey, so if what you are saying is true, I think maybe related specifically to some of the health impacts, why are some people living longer than they ever have in human history? Yet at the same time, you're presenting information about the impacts, the increased levels of mortality or morbidity related to climate. I thought, an interesting question. I don't know to what level you can speak to maybe some of that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, mortality is so multifactorial. This also speaks to our perspective here in New England, where even though we have some particulate matter, we're protected, I think, from a lot of the bad aspects of climate change at this point anyway. But worldwide, it is devastating. The quality of air in the third world and the exposure to heat. There's going to be large areas of the world that are going to be uninhabitable. And so you're right. People who live healthy lifestyles in safe areas, who have the advantage to go into an air-conditioned house when it gets hot and when the air is bad, you can adapt to this without question. But not everybody has that luxury to be able to adapt, I guess, is one way of saying it.
Well, and it was not long after Adam submitted that question, Mike, another participant, asked that question that you just touched on there is, where does equity come into the equation here? And I know you touched on it in a variety of ways, but I mean, I guess if you wouldn't mind just reiterating, I mean, where are you seeing perhaps some of those uh, inequities, I guess, across the board when it comes to some of the health impacts of climate change?
Well, I can speak to that one. There's a lot of different ways that it can be unequal, and in this country, a lot of those inequalities have to do with race and poverty. So, for example, when we talked about air pollution and how people of color were much more likely to have asthma, for example, than white people, part of that is because they're much more likely to live next to the polluting infrastructure. And there's sort of generations of policies that have already happened that have led to that sort of situation that has increased that kind of inequity. Additionally, if you have the resources, you can protect yourselves from some of these problems in ways that others can't. So, I know people who were involved in hurricanes who were able to, after the hurricane, they were able to leave their damaged homes and go somewhere that had air conditioning and fresh water. But others who don't have the resources to evacuate aren't able to do that. So those are just a couple examples.
I appreciate that.
I think one example very close to home is that a company recently tried to build an asphalt factory in downtown Nashville, believe it or not, in an area that was zoned appropriately for that. But it was a poor section of Nashville where a lot of immigrants lived in apartment buildings that weren't air conditioned. And a large group of people obviously thought that, including the mayor. And our group was involved in testifying about that. And it was stopped. But that's the kind of thing that has happened traditionally is, people put these kind of factories right in areas of high density population and have gotten away with it, honestly.
Well, and even just across the board, I think about, how frequently we've been using air conditioning here in northern New Hampshire compared to, it used to be decades ago. I mean, go back a long ways ago. New Hampshire is where you'd go vacation for natural air conditioning, and
Right.
it's becoming certainly more necessary in certain parts of the summer to really try and escape the heat, which is a newer challenge, perhaps for those of us used to kind of the cooler climes up this way. I wanted to. There are a lot of fantastic questions here, including one from William who asks about, first off, he thanks you for the program and mentions that he's in the insurance business and climate change is drastically impacting the cost of property insurance, even in low risk areas and like New Hampshire, due to cost and lack of capacity in the reinsurance market. Do you have an estimate or can you speak to how climate change might be impacting the health insurance claims? I mean, I know you're on the medical side of things, but I mean, how does this impact insurance, medical insurance, to the best of your um,
I
knowledge
think
here?
honestly, I mean, if you are a person with lung disease and you have worsening asthma during the spring and summer because of high pollen counts, I mean, that's COPD exacerbation, and that is covered. If you're out in an extreme heat day and you come in with hyperthermia to the emergency room, that's covered. So uh, I think these events are all covered, but it's probably going to drive the insurance costs up without a doubt if these things keep going the way they are.
Yeah, interesting avenue of climate that I mean, certainly, yeah, we hear about maybe property insurance and places becoming uninsurable, but from the healthcare side of things, including what it does to our insurance costs, I'm sure nobody wants to see those go up. And there we go. Um, Really interesting comment and question from Patty here, who's saying, again, thank you. Really appreciate this informative and interesting topic. Patty is a physical therapist at an acute care hospital in a coastal city in New Jersey, and said that we've seen an increase in infected wounds, respiratory illness exacerbations, increase in Legionnaire's disease, mold, fungal infections, and heat illness already now in New Jersey. And Patty's asking basically, can you comment on what someone in their profession could do to motivate and maybe even mobilize colleagues and community members? Is asking maybe, hey, maybe there's an experience you've had in uniting with other groups, like, I don't know, the Appalachian Mountain Club or some other like-minded, perhaps, organization that you've worked with.
Well, I'm not sure if there is one in New Jersey or not, but our group is the affiliate of the Medical Society Consortium for Climate Action. And if there is a group in New Jersey, recommend getting in touch with them. And if not, it's not that hard to start your own group, and you can sign up on their website and talk with people there, or email us after the show, and we'd be happy to talk to you about how to get it started. And there are an amazing number of resources about this online as well.
Appreciate that. Um, Another great question here from John. I know you might have I know you mentioned obviously about heat related impacts, and John here is mentioning the concept of wet bulb globe temperature, which in meteorology is all the rage because it's being a little facetious here, but seeming to be kind of the preferred method for calculating heat stress. I mean, heat index, we hear all the time, broadcast meteorologists using that figure. Um, and so it's kind of a newer development that I've heard even in areas, like the deep South, where football practice might be happening in August and really trying to set a safety standard. To the best of your knowledge, I mean, do you know in New Hampshire what, I guess, regulations or conversation is happening around, I guess, setting standards for protecting either, whether it's folks doing manual labor, construction, school athletics, those sorts of pieces. Is that something that either of you are aware of much?
I really do not know the answer to that. I don't know if you do, Bob. I know that as far as my kids participating in high school sports in the summer, there never seems to have been a cutoff temperature. They seem to be sent out on cross country runs when it's very hot and humid. But that might be
Yeah,
one.
truthfully, and I don't,
I
know the
gotta believe there
conversation around
is
it either.
also, but I don't know it.
That's all right. Well, for me, I know
Well,
I'm a wuss when it gets hot, so I hope there is, for somebody's sake, anyway, some good guides and references out there. Relatedly, in terms of guidance and training here, Kenneth asked a nice question. Are you aware of any kind of current or future initiatives for physicians getting training to recognize and respond to conditions that are caused or being influenced by climate change?
there are a lot of conferences now, um, for the emergency room physicians especially. There's tremendous um, education on how to deal with acute heat, especially, and there's a lot of research going on about this topic. So it's really part of physicians and nurses' continued medical education. You'd be hard pressed to go to an ER course and not have several lectures on these topics, honestly.
It's also a fairly new field in a way, though, in that it's just starting to be put into medical school curricula and those sorts of things. So depending on where you go, you might find more or less information about it. And our group is actually working with Dartmouth to try a pilot program to bring this to pediatrics offices in the Dartmouth system. So, and we're hoping to eventually expand that to other types of medical practices.
Yeah, if I could elaborate on that, one thing that we're trying to do, Deb's talking about climate informed care. And one thing that we are hoping to achieve is that studies do show that physicians and nurses, even after the COVID crisis, still have high levels of trust when it comes to health and climate. And so we in our perfect world, we would have people talk to family members and kids when they come into the office for their well child checkup, just talk about climate and health, and so that they're informed about it. And again, from our perspective, just educating people in this personal way would, I hope, kind of make people rise up and say, hey, we got to do something about this. This is more serious than I thought. And so that one-on-one education, we think, is very important.
Well, and so I might just ask one last question if you'll humor me a little bit. Kind of in that regard, I'm curious from the different interactions you've had and giving presentations like this one, going to community centers, libraries, working with colleagues, other people in the field. I mean, I guess like what surprises you about kind of getting into this topic and pushing for climate action? What what stood out to you, I guess, in your different interactions with people around the state in this topic?
Well, I can say that I speak to a lot of Rotary clubs, and so Rotary tends to be small business people. I think they may skew a little more to the right, and so we've had a few people. I wouldn't say challenge, but just ask some pointed questions about the science. But I have to say, by and large, people have come up after these talks and said, "My gosh, this is so important for us to know. Thank you for telling us." I mean, we have not had really, the pushback has been pretty minimal, I would have to say. Wouldn't you say, Deb?
I would agree. I've had almost no negative comments or anything like that.
We also have a group of letter to the editor writers in our group, and people have come up afterwards and all fired up. Oh, I'm gonna call my legislature. I'm gonna write this. I mean, who knows whether it happens? People get, but that's what we're just trying to fire people up.
Well, I certainly appreciate, I mean, you shared an incredible wealth of knowledge this evening, a lot of different resources, and want to make sure that folks, again, are aware. If you can just reiterate the name of your organization, where they can learn more information about your work and perhaps some other good sources of information, I'm sure everyone would appreciate that.
Sure. So we're the New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, and you can visit our website at www.nhclimatehealth.org, all one word, nhclimatehealth.org. And I think the CDC website and the EPA website have a lot of just basic facts and easy to read information. And you can also go to PubMed if you want to read all the scientific journals on this stuff, and it's amazing how much stuff you can find.
Also, on our website under resources, we do have a list that a couple of our members have put together of just individual actions that you can take to for health safety, but also for climate mitigation.
Lovely.
And we also didn't have a chance at all to get into this tonight, but there is that whole other side of adaptation part of solving climate change, which is one of the best ways that physicians and other healthcare workers are going to be able to help combat this problem. And so there's also resources out there on the internet about that as well.
That's great. I would imagine healthcare workers are already pretty good at adapting to their surroundings. So sure, it comes naturally. Well, I really appreciate it, Deb. Thank you so much, Bob. Again, thank you for sharing your expertise this evening. Thanks to everyone who joined the program tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's program, certainly we would strongly encourage you to donate to support free programs like these over at mountwashington.org. You can hit the donate button in the upper right-hand corner. If you have thoughts about tonight's program or suggestions, perhaps for future topics, please, I'd encourage you to take some time to fill out the survey that'll follow in the Zoom window here or in a thank you email after the program. And finally, don't forget to join us for an upcoming Science in the Mountains program. We currently have the next 3 months of programs available over at mountwashington.org, including next month's program on Tuesday, December 5th, just a few weeks from now, featuring Chris Kelly from Revision Energy. He'll be talking all about the science of solar and how technologies such as solar and heat pumps operate New England's variable climate. So don't forget to register for those programs and watch any of the ones you may have missed. And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks again. Thanks so much, Bob. Thanks, Deb. Have a great night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.